Okay. Oh, okay, because I had start and stopped it. So hopefully it's working. Okay. Let's see. I'm hearing myself twice here. Okay. Well, welcome to this module. I thought we would do the, the schedule calls for typography and advanced typography and font creation to be on a Tuesday and Thursday. And then for logos, branding and packaging to be on a Monday and Wednesday. So we'll do the logos, branding and packaging on Monday, and then we'll do this on Thursday. I'm sorry, it'll be on let's see, we do Monday and Wednesday, right?
Wednesday.
Yeah, we do Monday and Wednesday. Okay, so Wednesday will be type, Monday will be logos, branding and packaging. Okay, so this module is called Advanced Typography and Font Creation, and the font creation is not something that we do, even though it's labeled that. To this day, I've always wondered why they were they incorporated font creation into this, because in order to create fonts, I mean, that's an entirely different topic and discipline and software that you need to do that. But I do want to kind of bring your attention to font design, and I'll explain in a minute. I'll recommend a video of a font designer. He's since passed away several years ago, someone that I got a chance to meet and actually spoke at Platt College. Patty arranged for him to speak. His name is Doyle Young, and he is really considered one of the premier type designers and typographers, you know, just wealth of knowledge. He's known all over the world, and he, you know, I didn't grasp the scope of who he was when he spoke at Platt College, and I found out so much on that day, and I'll relate my story to you because that's kind of what I wanted to open up with. But let me just, before I do that, let me just kind of go through an overview of what I want to talk about first, and then we'll get into other things. So I'm going to share my screen here and go to this. And in this lecture, including probably the next lecture also, because I don't think we're going to get through all of this, is I used to give a very complete lecture in G1 when I taught the typography module there. And the problem with doing that in G1 was that most of the students in G1 were brand new students, you know, didn't know anything really about graphic design, or, you know, probably didn't even know what the word typography meant. And so when I would talk about these things, you know, I could just see it going in one ear and out the other, you know, because there just wasn't a maturity there to appreciate what typography was. And I've always thought that, you know, this is a class that should be taught way in the end of the program, where students have actually worked with typography, where they have, you know, experienced it on the computer. They've worked with point sizes and lettings and font families and all of that. Because when I talked about that in G1, I mean, there was just no understanding of that and really no appreciation for it. So that is something that I'm going to talk about. And although you may have knowledge of much of the, you know, kind of technicalities and ins and outs of typography, I'm going to give you my lecture on it. And I'm going to go through these topics here. and, you know, explain to you from my perspective and from the way I was taught some of the importance, really the importance of knowledge of this and how to utilize it to make your designs better. And typography by far is the #1 thing that designers look for in student portfolios. They look for your use of typography. In fact, it's been said that the minute you open up a portfolio, you can tell the caliber of design by the way that that person uses typography in their type usage. And that has been true for many years. And that was one of the first things that my first employer got on me for. I opened up my portfolio. He liked the work, but he looked at me and he smiled and he says, "You got a lot to learn about type, and I'm going to teach you." He was and that kind of segues into my story of Doyle Young. My first employer, as I've mentioned before, was a designer. He had an office on Wilshire Boulevard, and he was a corporate graphic designer. And so being a corporate graphic designer, he did things like facility brochures, corporate brochures, annual reports, and, you know, just a lot of kind of high-end, print graphics. Not the most exciting stuff, but definitely, you know, high-end and high-paying type projects. And they were, you know, they were okay to do. I didn't know whether I was going to like it or not, but I grew to like it. But he really taught me about type. And he told me that flat out, he says, you know, it's going to take you at least, and I don't know where he picked out 8 years, but he said, it's going to take you at least 8 years to fully understand typography. And after 8 years, the light bulb is going to go on in your head and you're going to say, aha, I get it. Now, I didn't know what he was talking about. And through those 2.5 years that I worked for him, I still don't know if I understood what he meant. But now I totally do. You know, in my old age and after doing this for so long, I can now see many things about typography that are not only important, but make your designs just, you know, just look better. And there's little things, there's subtleties, and I don't know, I play music, and one of the things we've always asked about, you know, musicians, one of the big questions is, can you learn to play, you know, okay, jazz, for instance. Okay, jazz is a good topic because jazz is really hard to play. It's hard to learn. Jazz musicians will say that you have to kind of be born with jazz in your blood in order to be a jazz musician. And I guess the question is, if you don't have it in your blood, can you learn it? Can you learn to play jazz? And that's been kind of an open question in music for, you know, for a long time. And we say the same thing about design, about designers and artists. You know, some of the best designers, some of the best students that I've had seem to have that feel in them already when they come in. They might not know a lot of things, but they have an eye, you know, they say an eye for design. And in that eye for design, you know, they really flourish in this. I've always believed as an instructor that you can learn to be a good designer. You know, if you know what to look for. Anyway, before I get on a rant, because this is a topic and this is a class that I really enjoy, and I have a lot to say about this, so please bear with me in the course of this class. We're going to talk about the importance of typography and just a lot of the, you know, basic functions of type, from what we call a typeface versus what we call a font. You know, they're different. A lot of people call fonts typefaces. A lot of people call typefaces fonts, but we'll distinguish that. Serif sans serif script and decorative type categories. There are more categories than that, but those seem to be have always seemed to be the 4 major categories of typography. And we'll talk about these categories, when to use certain, types of fonts in these categories. Type size, type leading, kerning, tracking, a lot of the things that we take for granted every day when we use Photoshop or InDesign. Alignment, legibility, readability, using positive type versus reverse type, when to use regular italics and bold, caps and lowercase, all of those things, which might seem to be, kind of like, well, duh, I already know that. But I'm going to give you my perspective on that and take a deeper dive into these basic type terms and functions of how we use it. Down here, I've recommended a video, and it is to Doyle Young, and his name is spelled very interesting. I wasn't sure how to pronounce this at first, but it's Doyle Young. Doyle Young is an icon in typographic design and logo design. The Prudential insurance company logo, the rock that is still being used today, was one that he designed. He's designed many famous logos that you've seen. He has been sought out all over the world to design logos for companies. He was an art center teacher back in the days when the art center was on 3rd Street in Highland Park, or in Hancock Park, I'm sorry, in LA. He went on to continue to teach at the Art Center in Pasadena, but when he was in Hancock Park at the first art center that started, which was, again, patterned after the Bauhaus, as far as form follows function, one of his students was my first employer, Ray Engel. And when I first started at Ray's office back in 1981, Ray sat me down in his office and he said he's going to make me do these type exercises. Although he was hiring me to work for him Monday through Friday from 9 to 5, he said, you're going to do homework every night. And he said, you're going to show me that homework on Friday nights. We're going to meet in the office and you're going to show me. And I'm going to teach you the ins and outs of typography. And he took me over to his bookcase and he said, John, he said, I want to show you an example of good design. I went over to his bookcase. He pulled out this book of all text. And it was a book written by Paul Rand, who was, famous logo designer. We all know Paul Rand for IBM and, UPS and all of that. And he said, this is an example of good type design. And as he showed me that book, he looked in my face and he looked at how I was reacting to that. And he says, you don't understand, do you? And I said, I don't know, man. This is just like, it's like a book, it's like copy. And he goes, well, he said, over the course of working for me, I'm gonna show you the beauty of this and the functionality of choosing a good typeface, line length, leading, all of that. So I was in for, at that moment, I knew what I was in for in working for him. Anyway, going back to this first topic here on the importance of design, importance of typography. Ray was the one that kind of introduced me to that whole deal. So fast forward, okay, to Platt College. This was maybe I want to say in the 90s, probably like mid 90s. Okay, I started at Platt in 1992. So maybe late 90s, yeah. Patty was teaching at Newport Beach. We used to have a campus in Newport Beach. And let me get off of this for a sec. And Patty knows so many, people in the business. And she knew Doyle Young, and she scheduled Doyle to speak at Platt College. And this is when we just moved to our Ontario campus. And so we invited the other Platt campuses for that talk. and Doyle Young was the guest speaker. And so we had a campus in Los Angeles, we had a campus in Newport, and we had the Ontario campus, all three. So we invited all the graphic design students. And back then, our program was big. I mean, we had like, you know, I don't know, maybe 150 students in these programs. And so we all gathered at Ontario, and they gave the talk in the kind of in that life drawing room where we do life drawing now. And it was a huge turnout. And Doyle Young spoke. But the story I want to tell you was when Doyle Young came that day, I was teaching G1, and he was scheduled to speak at around 10 o'clock. And so he came into the G1 classroom, and he just walked in, you know, and I was teaching class, and I didn't even recognize who he was. And he popped his head in and he said, "Oh," he says, "I'm looking for Patty." And if you listen to Doyle Young, if you watch this video, which I'm going to ask you to do, and it's a very dry video, okay, and I understand because Doyle Young talks around 3 miles an hour, okay? He will talk like, "Well, John, how do you do? I'm Doyle Young," you know, and he's very, you just see him, and he's just this very majestic kind of statuesque type of person. I don't know if I can even describe him, but he's very proper. You know, this guy never went to college. He never got a formal education. He's totally self-taught, and he's probably one of the most respected and, you know, self-taught graphic designers. Anyway, he sits down, I introduce myself, he sits down at a drawing board, and I start talking to him, and he says, "So, John, how long have you been teaching?" Little did I know, he's like one of the master senseis at the Art Center in Pasadena. And I said, "Well, you know, I've been teaching blah, blah, blah." And so he goes, "Wonderful," you know, and he says, "We need good graphic design teachers." And so he said, "So tell me, John," he goes, "where, you know, where have you worked?" And so I begin to tell him my career, and he, you know, we stop on the first person that I tell him. I said, "I used to work, my first job was for a guy named Ray Engel." And he goes, "No kidding." And he goes, "Ray was one of my students." And that once he told me that, boy, the respect level went zing, you know? And I said, "No kidding." And he said, "Yes." And he said, "He's very successful." He says, you were very lucky to have worked for him." And so anyway, kind of making the story a little shorter. Ray was, you know, he was a very tough guy to work for. Probably the toughest employer that I've ever worked for, but probably one of those employers that taught me the most. You know, it's always the guy that you don't like the most that teaches you the most. And he really was hard. He was really hard on me. And anyway, all those type little exercises that he gave me, I realized that moment that those were the exercises that Doyle Young gave to Ray in his class. And I'm suddenly looking now to the grandfather of all of this. And I started telling him, I said, "Yeah, Ray used to make me draw letters with a mechanical pencil that you'd have to sharpen in a grinder. And you watch this video, and that's exactly Doyle Young's style." And so now I know that he taught Ray how to do that. Anyway, that is the kind of school of typography that I went through. And whether you get to that level, and I have never gotten to the level of Doyle Young, you know, nor do I really desire to want to learn as much as Doyle Young knows about typography. I mean, this guy knows the anatomy of typography like Michelangelo knew the anatomy of the human body. I didn't even know there were that many parts to a letter form. And that's his expertise. What I want to do in this class is teach more of, you know, or what I should be teaching in this class is more not of the anatomy of type, but of how to use type as a graphic designer, you know, and the different applications. But a lot of it is going to have to go back to understanding things like anatomy and where things come from. You know, when we say points, when we, you know, we what is a point? You know, let me ask you guys, what is a point? Do any of you know? When we say it's 12-point type, I mean, I know you look at that as, you know, small type, but what is the measurement of it? Where do we measure type to get 12 points? First of all, what is a point? You know, we still use points and picas when we talk about typography. You know, it hasn't changed since the old days of the Gutenberg. We've been measuring in points and picas. Leading, you know, and I think I might have mentioned leading when we were watching that letterpress video or the
uh-oh. Yes, and that's still recording. Ay. There he is. Can't hear you.
I'm unmuted. I'm unmuted. I'm sorry.
There we go.
Yeah.
Okay. I wasn't muted the whole time, was I?
No. It just froze.
Just
I thought
froze.
It froze for a little while, yeah.
Okay. All right, so those are the things that I want to talk about, and I'm going to get into it right now because we're almost halfway through. But I'm going to start this, and in the meantime, I'm going to have you guys watch that video on Doyle Young. I think Carly said that she might have shown that video in class, but you know, it's hard watching. So watch it on your own time. Watch it when you have time, and try not to fall asleep on it. But he says a lot of good stuff. Okay, it's a really interesting biography of him, and he's a type master. Okay, let me go to my share screen here. And first of all, I'm going to start with just to say the importance of typography. Obviously, it is so important in graphic design because type is the main way that we communicate. Now, verbally, we communicate. Visually, we communicate. But so much of communication is the written word, and we read. We read constantly all day long. And so it's really important for us as designers to really understand how people read, how we communicate messages, from what typeface we use, what size we use, what the leading is, what the font is. All of those things are so vitally important to how people read. Now, they don't care. Okay, the audience 95% of the time could care less about what font you use. They don't know, they don't care. But how they read is of vital importance to us, because if they have a hard time reading it, they won't. And we're already in a society that reads less and less. So getting that message out is even more important to us. If you look at advertising, back in the days that we studied, you know, in graphic design history, you'll see so much copy, right? Because that's all people did was read. Today, copy is minimal. You see very little copy in advertising. So, you know, just that alone tells you. But anyway, the importance of typography. Okay, so let's get into, first of all, these terms, okay? A typeface, font, and family. Typeface, font, and family. And I'm going to go to InDesign here and just kind of define these terms. A typeface is the name of the face, okay? So when we say Helvetica or Garamond or Bodoni or whatever, that is called a typeface. A font is what that typeface contains. Now, all typefaces, as you know, and I'm going to go to font book, okay? And in font book, we have all of these fonts in our computer, but A font is what is contained in a typeface. So in this particular typeface, they're showing us capital letters and lowercase letters and numbers. But in most fonts, in most typefaces, the font set contains periods, punctuation, alternative characters. It will give us alternative characters for different languages, with tildes on top or accent marks going right and left and all of that. That is what's called the font set. Okay. The font is not, Aller Light. That is called the typeface. Okay. So just, at your next graphic design cocktail party, you'll be able to distinguish with your knowledge now of the difference between a font and a typeface. A font family, of course, is all of those related typefaces and fonts that relate to that particular typeface. So in this case, I'm highlighting this. This is Minion Pro. And when I look down here, this is the family of Minion Pro. Okay, we have bold condensed, bold italic, italic medium, etc. Now, not all typefaces have families. Think of a family as your cousins. Okay, everyone that's related to you in some way usually carries your same name, but they're different. So italics and bold and condensed and extended and light and heavy, and you'll see all of these terms depending on what typeface you choose. Now, choosing a typeface that has a large family is something you might consider if you're doing something that's going to use a lot of different emphasis or a lot of different fonts, like let's say a catalog. Let's say you're doing the 450-page B&H photo catalog. Now, when you're designing that, if you're on the ground floor where you're, involved in something like that, you want to choose a typeface that has a good size family, because you're going to be using all of those things. Sometimes you might want to use condensed. Sometimes you might want to use bold condensed or extra bold condensed or extended or whatever. So you can get a different look from different typefaces by using different family members. Okay, and it's better to do that than to go to an entirely different typeface. The rule of thumb they've always said is use maybe 2 or 3 different typefaces per project. But rather, a smarter way would be using 2 or 3 different family members instead of totally different fonts, okay, or different typefaces. Okay, so that's what a type family is. A type family just simply is members of that. Now, the same cuts, they'll have the same cuts, meaning that the design of the serifs or the design of the stroke weights will be the same, even though it's condensed versus, extended or italic or whatever. It'll still have that same feel, and that's what you want to use. And please don't ever just use this field up here where you can actually stretch any font or condense any font, because the problem with that, and I'm going to highlight this ALG, and if I went up here to this 100% and I just kind of clicked something drastic like 25%, okay, and do something like that, all right, that is, you'd be shot for that. Doyle Young would pull out his gun and shoot you. Okay, this is just a total bastardization of type. These programs allow you to do that, but yes, you certainly don't want to do that. You would want to find, if that's what you wanted, you would want to find an extended typeface of that, of that family. Okay, and maybe one exists and maybe one doesn't. At the same time, you don't want to do something like this, where you're just automatically condensing a font and end up, with something that looks like that. Okay, yeah, the program allows us to do that, but, again, that's a no-no. Okay, so if you are going to go to a condensed version of type or an extended version of type, find it in the family. Myriad is a great you know, if I change this font to Myriad, Myriad Pro, let me just go to Myriad. I'm just going to type into that. You can see, oh, okay, this is Myriad Arabic. I'm sorry. Let me just go to Myriad Pro. Okay. And then look at the family here. I do have condensed, italic, bold, bold condensed, semi-bold, you know, so I've got a lot of different, you know, things to use. Okay. There's a natural Myriad condense. So rather than using this up here to condense it, you can see how the stroke weights are nice and even, and it was designed that way. So I like using Myriad because it, you know, has a really nice, you know, it's a nice cut for sans serif typeface. Okay. This is Minion Pro, which is a basic sans serif kind of slab serif font. But we'll talk about the slab serifs and the different types of serifs in a sec. Okay, so anyway, those three differences, or those three things, typeface, font, and family. Then again, we have the styles of type, mainly serif styles and sans serif styles. Okay, now there's other things like script and decorative fonts that we categorize. In fact, if you go to DeFont and you look at the categories of fonts that they have here, they'll have script fonts, basic, they say, you know, they categorize it kind of in a different way. You know, serif, sans serif. They have Gothic, techno, foreign look, fancy, you know, cartoon fonts and things like that. But if you break all of this stuff down into four categories, you know, keeping it simple, you know, you come to sans serif, serif, script, and decorative fonts. And decorative means kind of all of your miscellaneous fonts. All of the fonts that you can't really categorize as serif or sans serif. For instance, in DeFont, this would be, I guess, considered a decorative font. I mean, a script font, okay, kind of a calligraphic script font. I guess you could say that might be also, but what is this? Okay, there's so much garbage in DeFont. There's so many fonts that are just, you know, you can't really categorize them in anything. They're almost like scribbles, like someone just kind of, you know, created a scribble and made a font out of it. Making a font is very easy with a font program, and there's a lot of font programs out there. You guys can make your own font real easy. Call it, you know, Lauren regular, Lauren bold, Lauren italic, you know, whatever. But so, you know, decorative, script, sans serif, and serif. And let's talk about, you know, first of all, let's talk about the two main categories, which is serif and sans serif. And because you've taken the history of graphic design, I don't think we really talked about that in there, but serif fonts have always been the most traditional type fonts. And it's important to know the history of a serif font. It goes back much further than sans serif typefaces. Serif fonts, this is a serif font here. This is a very typical serif font. It's what's called a slab serif font. And the slab serif fonts, they're called slab serifs because the serifs are squared off, just like the Roman columns and the Greek columns used to be. And that's how original type was designed. It was designed after architecture, after Greek architecture and Roman architecture. So fonts kind of follow the same thing. Now, why would they design a font that flares out like this, like a column? Okay. Well, back in the days of architecture, columns gave stability. They gave the base, you know, they provided a base to a building. And so when fonts were designed, when type fonts were designed, they were also designed to give stability to the letter form. This is called a slab serif because it's like a slab of concrete. It comes off the main stem, it rolls off into a straight vertical down that creates this slab right here. This is the serif right here. There are different types of serifs. There's rounded serifs, there's pointed serifs, And the type of serif represents the type and the feel of that particular serif font. So a pointed serif would be much more formal and delicate, and well, formal is really the term that's used for that type of serif. But in general, serifs are much more formal than sans serif typefaces. But we have the slab serif, the pointed serif, the rounded serif, and then we have like Garamond that comes off to a rounded serif, and then the base kind of moves up and down. It kind of curves. It's a much more natural flow. Again, I don't want to get into the anatomy of a letter form as Doyle Young does, but that kind of tells you when you might use this type of font. Okay, so serif fonts have been thought of to be used in formal situations. You don't really see serif fonts being used for any kind of modern look, like aerospace or technology. If you look at all the tech companies from Google to Apple to everybody, sans serif is the font of choice today in the minimalist movement. Okay, rarely do you see serif fonts anymore, but they will come back. Okay, I guarantee you. They have been the go-to font for all kind of publications, from magazines to newspapers to your romance novels and Barnes and Nobles and all the textbooks that have been written. In fact, Century School Book, which is a classic serif typeface, has been used for just about every textbook that's been written since the beginning of education. Now, another reason serif fonts are used quite a bit in very basic communications is because there's much more distinction in a serif font than there is in a sans serif font. So if I kind of duplicated, another L here, oops, let me make my text box a little bit bigger here. I'm sorry. Pull that out. And if I highlighted this and made this, a sans serif font, like say Helvetica, let me just make that, oops. I'll go Helvetica, plain or whatever. Okay, that's good. And you can see the point I'm trying to make here is that this is a very simplified L. It has no distinction other than two straight lines going down. And if I put two L's together, you would sometimes have a hard time distinguishing the letter form itself, because it would look like two sticks next to each other. Whereas the serif L has distinction. It has serifs that come out that give this form style and distinction. So in looking at fonts or looking at typefaces, we can see that some are easier to read because they just naturally have more distinction in the letter form itself. Now I know that, I know there's only 3 letters here, but in a whole block of copy like this, if you didn't know, serif typefaces are much faster and easier to read in body text than sans serif typefaces are. Now you might ask yourself, well, how come I see so much sans serif body copy out there? Well, it's a style that a lot of people are using, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the most functional. Okay, the most functional body copy, and when I say body copy, I'm talking about type that is 12 points or less. That has always been considered body copy. Anything above 12 points is kind of, getting into the realm of, I don't want to say display copy, but display copy is usually larger text. It's called display because it's used for headlines and large display. Body copy is usually used for description and content. So in that sense, there is a difference between the sans serif and the serif, okay? And I would say that the most distinction is in the style itself and how it's used. Okay, so when you're looking at something formal in nature, if you're doing a graduation invitation or a wedding invitation, and you're not using script, you might use script for the main heading in a wedding invitation. But if it's description, you would use a serif type font. It would just make more sense because of the formality of it. If you're eating at a fancy, posh French restaurant and you looked at the menu, the entrees would probably be in serif, in the serif font. Now, I know you're going to go out and say, well, I ate at a fancy restaurant and it was sans serif, okay? Right now, anything goes, and, there's a lot of stuff out there, but I'm just giving you the traditional definitions of, when to use these things and kind of the history behind it. Now, the sans serif, again, has always been the most modern, okay? As you know from history of graphic design, it was used in the Plakat period in Germany. We saw lots of sans serif fonts. And sans serif kind of comes and goes, but in the 60s here in the United States, in the 60s and 70s, sans serif, Helvetica, actually, there was a whole movie made on Helvetica. And that became, kind of the most popular typeface out there, along with Futura. And Futura Extra Bold Condensed used to be the advertising agency's favorite typeface in the 1980s. But the sans serif typeface has always been simplicity. It's been clean. The stroke weights are even, whereas in serif typeface, we also have a difference in variance of stroke weights. We always have the thick and thin stroke weights, whereas the sans serif type fonts are usually, evenly weighted. So we'll see the even weights all through the font itself. Now that becomes simpler, but sometimes that becomes harder to read, okay? Especially in mass, when we have lots of body copy in a sans serif typeface, sometimes the words get hard to read. So that's something that, has to do with your choice, and it might not make that much of a difference, but at least you now know. Okay. As far as the other two categories, script and decorative fonts, they have their own uses, but they should be used very sparingly and very conservatively. Like you would never set a whole block of text like this in script. Okay, please, please don't do that. And usually, beginning design students will do something like that, and they'll do something like, maybe this. Oops, why do I keep doing that? Okay, I have seen this so many times. I'm sorry. Let me just do that. Okay. And please don't do that. Unless you want this to be something that people do not read, then go ahead, go for it. But this is very difficult to read. Italics in mass is very hard to read. We really limit the amount. This is almost like an italic face. Anything like Old English or things like that should only be used as, maybe one word or two at most. I don't know, but those are very decorative fonts. Script fonts are hard to read, and yet, Coca-Cola probably made, it's used for Coca-Cola. It's been used for that logo. For logos and things like that, it's fine, but yeah, watch your usage of script. I'm not saying don't use it, but be very careful about that. Okay, I put this up here, and you've probably been looking at that, so I'm going to skip over to this, which is size and leading. And when I asked you about point size, okay, here's the definitive definition of a point size and where that measurement is taken from. Okay, the the square around this, or the rectangle around this, represents the slug. And as you remember from watching that video on type slugs and hot metal type, you can see that the slug was actually melted into, I mean, the letter form was actually melted into the slug, and the slug was actually taller and deeper than the highest ascender and the lowest descender of type. The best way to look at that is if you remember the old typewriter where the keys came over and smashed the paper, and if you look down into the keys, you can see the slug. Each letter was a slug attached to a rod that smashed the paper through an ink ribbon. And that's how you got the letter form printed on a piece of paper. Well, the slug was higher and lower, and that is actually where the measurement of type actually comes in. So when we talk about 12-point type, it's this measure here from the slug. Because if you went in with a point ruler, and I don't even know if they make point rulers anymore, but I used to have one. And if you measured from the top of the descender to the bottom of the descender, it would not measure 12 points. A lot of people thought the measurement of type was from the cap height, okay, which it's not either. But most people, if you Google this, most people, you know, a lot of people will think that the type measurement is from the top of the descender to the bottom of the descender, but it is from the slug. Now, we don't know what the slug is. So when we refer to 12-point type or 10-point type, 18-point type, it really won't measure that. But now that you know where that measurement comes from. Now, does that make a difference in how you do set type? No. Okay, but it's just, you know, just something to, again, know as a graphic designer. This is what's called the true point size.
Yeah, because I know that like 100 points is 1 inch. You know what I mean? Like with certain measurements like that, like for some reason, like that's what I've realized. So like when someone's like, oh, I want 3-inch letters and things like that, then I'll just put 300 points.
Oh, okay. Well, there's a formula here, and the formula is simply 6 points is equal to 1 pica. Okay, which really doesn't make any sense, because if you don't know what a point is and you don't know what a pica is, what's the point of this? But if I also told you that there are 12 points to 1 inch, that makes more sense, right? Now you know what a point is, because we know what an inch is. Most of us grew up measuring on a ruler, 1 inch. We could say it's that much. So if there's 12 points to 1 inch, then a point is actually 1/12 of an inch, right? And what are we used to when we're measuring on a ruler? The smallest increment that we are used to measuring is probably 1/16 of an inch. So you could say that, well, okay, no, I'm sorry. Oh boy, I'm sorry. I am sorry. I'm confusing you, but there it is, okay? There are 12 points to 1 pica. And there are 6 picas to 1 inch, okay? That is it. There are 12 points is equal to 1 pica. 6 picas is equal to 1 inch. So if we do our math and we say, okay, if 12 points is equal to 1 pica, 6 picas is equal to 1 inch, how many points are equal to 1 inch? Well, 6 times 12 is 72 points, right? 72 points is equal to 1 inch. So this is what a point is. A point is 1/72 of an inch. That's a really small increment because the smallest increment we're used to measuring is 1/16 of an inch. So 1 point is microscopic. It's 1/72 of an inch. So 12 points is very small type, and it's measured from the top of the slug to the bottom of the slug. Okay, so throw that on your next graphic design guru and see if they know that. Okay, but anyway, not that this makes that much of a difference, but you know, basically, you know, a point is a very small increment of measurement. So that's where the measurement of points comes in. So when you come up to InDesign and you type in, you know, points up here, we're still measuring in points as far as, you know, these programs are concerned. Now underneath points is leading, and leading is simply the distance from baseline to baseline of 2 or more lines of type. So if and I'm going to end with this because we're getting to the point, but if I zoom into here, if I bring a guide down and put it underneath this first line, and I bring another guide down and bring it underneath the second line, this distance, okay, if you can see, oops, you have to see it this way, okay. This distance from this line to this line is the measurement of leading when we deal with typography. So when this says 12 over 14.4, okay, this is actually 14.4 points. Okay, so that's where that comes in. And when I increase the leading of this text, then the lines start separating and start getting deeper and deeper. Okay, so that's technically what leading is. That's the measurement. What they used to do in back in the days of hot metal type is they used to put a block of lead between the slugs. So let's say this represents the slug, okay? And they used to fill this with lead. So, you know, the lead would be that right there. Now, the thicker that piece of lead was, the more the lines would start separating and getting deeper and deeper. And so that's why they call it leading. It's just a strange way of dealing with typography in this day and age, but we still refer to these terms, these ancient terms. You know, I call it ancient, but they're not really ancient. But these archaic terms when we deal with typography, and they're in all the software programs that we use. Okay, so I'm going to stop this here. When we pick this up next, I'm going to talk about line length, how wide you should set a line of text. Okay, there are rules to be followed. It's not just an arbitrary line length. Like this is 8.5 by 11 inches, but should I set 12-point type this wide? Okay, I mean, yeah, I can. I could do anything in InDesign. But is this the correct thing to do? Especially if I printed this out and people have to read it. Okay, and we'll find out, no, we don't want to do that. Okay, we probably want to set this about that wide for optimum reading. Okay, and there's rules why. So we'll talk about that. In the meantime, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to watch this video on Doyle Young. Okay. This is the man. This is some of the work that he does. And yeah, it's a 42-minute video, but you'll learn a lot from the master of typography, what he, you know, letter forms. And then we'll pick up our discussion next. On Monday, we'll have the logos, branding, and packaging Zoom meeting for that. Okay, so we'll pick this up again on Thursday. Okay, I don't have an assignment yet for that class, but we'll start with this. Yeah, it's almost 11 o'clock, so I'll end it with that and see you guys on Monday.
See you Monday.
Okay, have a good
See you
weekend.
Monday. You too.